And are we good? Can we go? So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming to this year's ArtWORK conference. Before we introduce ourselves and our speakers, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been home to the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land, and we invite you to reflect on the land on which you stand as well. My name is Marina. I'm a co-chair for the Education and Outreach subcommittee for the Art Student Committee at the Hart House. And I'm gonna pass it on to Bronwyn, who is the other co-chair.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. We are so excited to introduce today's panel, which is comprising of various contributors from the Tree Protection Zone project at the Hart House Commons. So the project is a temporary public art installation featuring work by 8 Indigenous artists and their collaborators. Today they will be discussing their project and their individual careers in relation to today's panel's theme, art relations in urban spaces. Feel free to type your questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll get to them during our Q&A session at the end of the talk. And I'm now going to hand things off to Mikinaak Migwans, who will be our moderator for the session.
All right, Miigwech, both of you guys. All right, I'm going to go through and introduce our speakers today, and then I'm going to briefly introduce the kind of topic of our panel, and then I'll hand it over to Maria to expand on the project itself, and then we'll hear from our artists. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself, Mikinaak Migwans. I'm assistant professor in the art history department here at U of T, and I'm curator of Indigenous art at the Art Museum. So I co-curated the Tree Protection Zone project with Professor Maria Hupfield, and my current project is Nations by Artists, co-curated with Sarah Robayo Sheridan, which is open till April 2nd at the Art Museum here. Next up, I'll introduce Q Rock, who is a Nipissing-born, Toronto-based, multidisciplinary artist. He's versed in both woodlands and hip-hop styles, including graffiti, emceeing, DJing, b-boying. You'll recognize his recent mural work in Toronto at the Daniels faculty over here. And upcoming this May, we'll look for his Terry Fox mural at Sick Kids Hospital. I think we'll post some links to these projects in the chat, so look there. Also check out Q's speaker series in connections with the Daniels mural. And as well, since we're talking about art relations today, Q's art relations include mentors like Leland Bell and Perry McLeod, as well as the Zulu Kings, Pop Master Fable, and the Ready to Rock crew. Q was the first artist to transform a hoarding on the Hart House Commons this past summer as part of the TPZ project. So we're really excited to bring him here to talk to you guys. All right, next I'll introduce Kristi Chen, who is among the first two of the art assistant crew for the TPZ project. So Kristi Chen is a Toronto-based interdisciplinary artist who uses sculpture to explore surreal creatures, futures, and possibilities. She's a recent OCAD grad, and she now works at the OCAD Sculpture Installation Studio. So she's also a prolific collaborator. Her recent works include collaborative projects at Xspace and 1352 Mississauga, and watch for her upcoming work in the Alora project. Her art relations include her great-grandfather, who was Chinese painter Ho Chat Yuen. You can correct my pronunciation later, and her father, whose storytelling and experiences she connects with through basketry. All right, and then of course we have Maria Kim, who is a Toronto-based painter who focuses on the body, human experiences, and forms of storytelling. She describes her own role as both an artist and someone who works for artists, and I know her best for her role in the TPZ project as many things, as the project coordinator, artist relations wrangler, and the teamwork dream worker. She's an OCAD graduate, she's a current graduate student, and she's also co-founder of the Mods Collective. She's coordinated mural projects and artist residencies worldwide, and she says her art relations are too many to count. So check out her project upcoming with the Toronto Arts Council at Gibson House. All right, so I'll just introduce the panel really quickly. It's called Art Relations in Urban Spaces. And what we'd like to talk about in this panel are relationships between artists, curators, helpers, and what it takes to coordinate a project, especially the importance of things like mentorship, skill sharing, knowledge sharing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maria Kim to introduce the project more generally and get us started. All right, thank you, Maria.
Thanks for that generous introduction. So excited to be amongst these great panelists. Tree Protection Zone, I'm going to actually quote from the Art Museum and the Hart House sites and giving context to where it sits. So in preparation for the Indigenous Landscape Project at Hart House Circle, as part of the University of Toronto's landmark initiative, Hart House Commons is transformed by a number of large tree protection hoardings, which have inspired a public art project entitled Tree Protection Zone, otherwise known as TPZ, which involved artists who elaborated these hoardings into a celebration of the garden and trees, the buried waterway, specifically Tattle Creek, that remains under the soil and the community that is centered there. The project has featured specially commissioned mural-sized works by 8 artists and their collaborators, considering the preservation of life, water, and kin, and how each is inextricably linked to the protection of trees. Barbara Fisher, the Executive Director, Chief Curator at Art Museum at the University of Toronto, who sits with us today, has said this major arts in public space project organized by the Art Museum introduces to the campus of the University of Toronto an as of yet rarely acknowledged but urgent sense of long-lived place amongst the ancient trees and care-for landscapes, and amidst this short span of cellular history as configured by the surrounding historic buildings, the curators and artists' work remind us of the intertwining of human and the planet's life, drawing out buried stories and standing both with and as protectors of the land. Furthermore, John Monahan, who is the warden of Hart House, has said the role of the public visual arts is such a powerful one. The presence of the Tree Protection Zone installation in the city and on the U of T downtown campus is an important visual declaration about the past, present, and future of this land and the Indigenous peoples who have been stewarding it for generations. So with that, I'm going to just try to share some slides. Are you able to see them? Here's the site. Here are the artists, going from top right to left, or left to right, sorry. Kristi Belker and Isaac Murdoch of Onaman Collective, Susan Blight, Shivnai Shuna, Takralik Partridge, and Nels Elu Itzi, and Carrie Hill and Kirok, who joins us. So this is just to give context to the many people who have gathered and worked for with commitment and determination for this project to actually take place. It is a temporal site project that sits on a site that is in transition and construction for it to become a garden. So I was actually placed into this project as the coordinator for the implementation phase, which took place during the summer last year. And it was a time just after the 3rd lockdown, one of our longest in Toronto. So I think everyone was super excited to be coming outdoors and into this public space, just to be together and to bring family and friends together for this project. Those who had been working on the project prior to me coming on board was the Art Museum and Hart House teams, the curatorial teams, and the invited artists. So these conversations were already happening. Those who we were constantly in relation to during the implementation phase were the exhibition coordinators, communications team, facilities, risk management, especially with COVID protocols, the media team, the documentation team, programming, the artist assistant team came together, the six assistants, and friends and family who had joined as assistants during the time. the duties and the people coming together brought about these kind of tasks, just looking at site access, how to get the supplies, the budgeting, timelines, contracts, scheduling, outdoor safety, working around the weather and each other, researching, planning, and implementing the project itself. Communication was a huge part of this, especially with the short timeline and the many people involved. So I think I will pass it off to Q at this point to talk about their experience coming on board. And as he prepares, these are just some pictures of the ways we were knowledge sharing and skill sharing during the time and figuring out how to translate designs and projects onto these wordings. We had a session with Isaac. This is Nils Ely with us on ground. This is a basket weaving workshop with Carrie Hill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chemigwech. I'll do like a modern introduction of myself in Anishinaabe. So Ani, Anishinaabe, Manitunimin, Nadishnikas. I'm from Nipissing First Nation. My artist name is Q Rock, and I am an Anishinaabe person first and foremost. It's a really important aspect of my influence and the direction for everything that I do, essentially. So being an Anishinaabe person, I was raised in a culture where ceremony is our education system. And in that education system, there are things like storytelling and painting and being creative and finding ways to share our story and to share the stories too that we learn along the way. One of the instructions that the Anishinaabe people were given was to share with one another. It's one of our core beliefs of how we're supposed to treat each other. And so I grew up in a family full of artists, essentially, because everyone learned our culture through dance, through singing, through ceremony, through so many different ways. It's an observation culture based off of communicating. So everything is spoken orally. There's no handwritten language. But we do use things that nature creates for us, like geometry patterns. In this photo, I was sharing with my helpers essentially how to do a doodle grid. And there's a lot of different layer techniques when you're painting murals, especially outside. And I typically wouldn't need to use a doodle grid for something this size. I would tend to use the doodle grid for like really large murals. But I just wanted to pass a skill that I learned along the way. It really helps. A doodle grid is really, it's really good for time saving. And if you're ever interested in creating murals, the one thing that I'd like to share with you about, like, if you're considering it, is just trust the process and yeah, just have a lot of fun, because painting murals is absolutely amazing. I studied, my background before I was painting murals, I was always involved in hip hop culture. Before I went to the city, I grew up in Nipissing First Nations, which is a reservation. It's about 4 hours from Toronto. And my culture is very much about the land and being connected to the land and being connected to our culture. And so when I moved to the city, I had this really set of strong values that are called the 7 grandfather teachings. And it really didn't allow me to like compromise anything in terms of like my values, because I was taught that it was so important to not break those for anything. And so when I went to Western culture for the first time, moving into the city off my reserve, there was a lot of things that I felt like I had to compromise, and I wasn't willing to do that. But when I found hip hop, that culture, I found something where I could fit into Western culture and still communicate through the ways that I was taught and fit in, which was really important to me when I was young. And so I used the art forms in hip hop as ways to communicate and share my culture and share my creativity, and also how to learn, because in hip hop culture, there's 4 art forms. Those art forms, there's a really tight relationship with each other. They all influence each other in a lot of ways. So I was always taught to to be like the best student I could possibly be, and never to really worry about being a master, just be like the best student. And so taking that attitude from hip hop culture, I brought it into different everything that I do, essentially anything that I'm into right now. The whether it's like, for example, when I painted this mural, I really wanted to do something that I had never done before, and I wanted to have something that had a message that I felt was strong and powerful, represented my people well. And so that, like, you never really know what the challenges are going to be, but there's always like a constant growth and evolution in your art form when you're, not necessarily just boxing yourself into one kind of style. I've always was really open-minded about learning from everyone, and not really worrying about being really good at stuff from the beginning, just more being interested in finding stuff that I like that would complement what I was doing already. So when I decided to become a muralist, I wasn't even sure if it was going to be a career choice. I just knew it was an experience that I wanted to have. And so I was fortunate where I have a friend who's a graffiti artist, and we were part of the same crew coming up in Toronto as a hip hop crew. We had a hip hop crew called DDT, and it was 2 crews kind of put into one. One was HSA, which is a graffiti crew. And then there was DDT, which was a DJ, MC, and B-boy crew. And we kind of like all merged. And that was around 1999. And since then, I've watched my brother develop to become one of the most elite graffiti artists in the world. His name is Alexander Bacon. And so he was my first mentor. And he essentially invited me into a world that I had no idea was even existed. And that's the whole, I guess, movement when it comes to street art and being a professional muralist. I had no idea it was in such a demand, that field. And I had no idea that graffiti was the sought out for art form, the sought out for medium. And so I've been fortunate to find that there's a program in Toronto called Street Art Toronto, or START. And essentially START created all these ideas for me. This was what I did last year. This is just what I did last year, except for the Terry Fox mural that's coming up in May. But last year was my 4th year as a muralist. And last year, I actually became other things that I had no idea that I was going to do. And that was become a designer and start designing things. I designed the cover for the TTC maps last year, and I included my culture. They wanted to do something towards the Indigenous groups that are from this area. I'm Anishinaabe, definitely from one of the Indigenous groups that are sovereign to this area. And so I was lucky with Street Art Toronto because their mentorship program is actually tailored specifically to the artist. It's not like they're not coming in with a blueprint that you have to fit into. It's not like that at all. It's really up to like you, what you want to do and how you want to create whatever career you would like. If you like to teach art, then they have the opportunities for you to grow. If you want to be a painter, depending on how large. When I first started, my first mural I ever painted with my mentor is it's the mural that's at the DuPont Bridge. I don't know if you've ever seen it at the junction. I think it's called Annette, DuPont, and Dundas West. But that was my first mural that I ever did. And I've always had a background in hip hop, so I was painting graffiti, but I was never doing things in like a positive way. It was pretty like, destructive the way I was painting. Everything else that I did in hip hop was really positive all my life. But every time I painted graffiti, I risked a lot. And the risk wasn't worth it. So I was fortunate that one of my friends, who also was a graffiti artist, who did the transition into becoming a street artist and being able to also become a designer and so much more. I also have another mentor. In fact, I've had mentors my entire life. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I've been able to have the experiences that I've been getting. It's because I've always been able to put myself around people that are, that I consider doing it, making moves. And there may not all be the most successful business people, but in terms of art, they're definitely people that I look up to, that I admire and appreciate their skills and their abilities. So that's basically my story in like a fast forward version. I'm a really excited person about the future these days when it comes to art. I just got started. Like, this is only my fourth year, my fifth year starting. And I don't have any more limitations. Like, I'm starting to understand that there are standards out there. And once you learn about the standards, it's really easy for you to gauge your own value and understand, how you can project your career and potentially how you can have a trajectory, especially if you get good mentors and if you have a really good, strong network. I was really fortunate to be part of this group and share, just a bit of my culture, and especially in the location, being in the heart of Toronto like that, to me is like, it's I kind of like take my position as kind of like an ambassador from Nipissing First Nation, where I'm from. And I always like to share when I can. So yeah, that's a bit about me. I can keep rambling on about this kind of stuff, but I'll pass the mic. I think that's 10 minutes, right? Cool.
Hi, my name is Kristi, and I'm the studio or artist assistant for the TPZ project. And I started with the TPZ project right after I graduated school. So I recently graduated from OCAD 8 months ago. And before then, I was doing my thesis for OCAD. And I'm just going to introduce my thesis first before I talk about the TPZ experience, because it's definitely very interrelated. And so for my thesis, I explored basket weaving through my father's side of the family. So my father actually is, I guess, one of my mentors in my art creation for my practice. He came from a village where basketry was a means of survival, but unfortunately he wasn't able to pick it up due to him having to do the entrance examination in China, and him just having this passion for physics. He just wanted to open up his opportunities and explore the world. So therefore he was unable to pick up basketry, but I thought that story was really interesting. So I decided to pick up this craft that he was supposed to strive for. And I decided to learn basketry through very interesting sort of methods. So I've learned basketry through the internet, actually, and through online uses. So when I first started, as you can see in the forms of the exhibition of my weaving, they're very organic looking. They kind of look like gourds and squashes. And I decided that was actually a really interesting way to introduce myself and start weaving. And the techniques I started using was twining. So I started making these forms with the method of twining maple reeds and creating these vessels. And when I started exploring my father's side of my family, I also wanted to explore my mother's side of the family. So my mother's grandfather was a Lingnan style Chinese painter, and his name was Ho Chot Yin. And on the right side of the presentation, you can see his painting. It's called Nine Fishes. And I decided to make a pond with his painting, inspired by his painting with robotic fish. And there is on the left side of the presentation, you can see like a woven deer that's inspired by my great-grandfather's painting as well. And I just wanted to explore collaboration and sort of using him as a mentor and an inspiration to create three-dimensional sculptures using weaving and different CNCing techniques. Go to the next slide. And yeah, so I'm an artist assistant at the TPZ, and I thought that was really amazing that I was able to, right after school, get this sort of experience working with different artists. And and working with different mediums as well, because I actually didn't really have a painting background when I started. So I thought that would be a really nice thing to just jump into it and get my hands into the whole process. And I didn't really know too much about Indigenous culture and just, the history behind it as well. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity for me to just learn, because as an artist, I'm always really curious. I always want to learn new new stories and new different ways of working, especially in the creative art field. And I was really, really lucky to be able to finally get my first in-person sort of basketry session, especially with Carrie Hill. On the right side of the photo, we had a workshop on basketry, and that was super meaningful to me because I learned basketry through online mediums, and to get an in-person session with an actual basket weaver, I thought that was super inspirational. And just getting to know each and everybody's stories and how they came about being an artist was also a very inspirational perspective to have as well. And just relating the stories that I've heard from the artists about their Indigenous culture and having to be able to relate to my culture is really important as well. There's a lot of interconnectivity between two cultures and a lot of similarities as well, which I find quite endearing to me. And yeah, so on the right side, we were working with Susan Blight on her decomposable stickers. And yeah, when we had a workshop with Carrie, and I also worked with Q as well with the spray painting. That was my first time as well. And it was just such an amazing experience to be mentored and also to be able to work with the artists one-on-one, for sure. And I think after the experience of TPZ, I was able to get a lot of opportunities working with other artists. So during the TPZ project, I was also in a residency at Xspace, and I was in a residency curating or working with these artists at the main space of Xspace to make an exhibition called Woven. And I thought that was really interesting being part of the TPZ project and doing this exhibition at the same time, using different types of weaving techniques and also working with other artists as well. It's very, having this experience of TPZ allowed me to collaborate with other artists as well and work as a team. And yeah, we had our exhibition debuted around October, but I think the TPZ project really allowed me to work with other artists, work with different mediums as well, and get the experience to sort of exhibit in that space. And on the right-hand side of the photo here in the presentation, it's a tree project that I did. So it's really interesting that I did the TPZ project, one tree project, and I moved on to another tree project. And this exhibition that I did with two other artists, it was an exhibition for Christmas. So it was a exhibition called the Festival of the Trees at Creative Hub 1352 Mississauga. And I wanted to continue with the whole basketry sort of technique and narrative. And we actually made the underworld of the tree. So instead of focusing on the top part of the tree, we're focusing on sort of the underworld with the root system, and just talking about the mother tree of the forest. So yeah, we have like a little woven mushroom top with a branch sticking out on the top of a plywood surface, and underneath we kind of used reed to create these networking systems, and the underworld and the root system that feeds all the other trees and gives it, nutrients and life to support the whole forest. So I thought that was a really interesting project to take on, and definitely the TPZ project helped guide me through these exhibitions and opportunities. Thank you.
All right, I'll just bring it around with maybe some curatorial reflections on the TPZ and maybe just what I think this project is about generally. So Maria Hupfield, my co-curator, and I initially were imagining this project as a sort of a practice space or a space for skill sharing to invite artists to kind of experiment in different kinds of ways of intervening in public spaces or skill sharing techniques, street art techniques especially, that can be used to making interventions in public spaces. This came on the heels of a lot of Indigenous activism, especially around Every Child Matters. And you'll recall over the summer, the protests that led to the removal of the Ryerson Monument. Things like these, I wanted to think about in terms of Indigenous interventions in space that actually are part of this decolonizing process of truth, right? Things coming to life, healing. And you know what, we'll talk about reconciliation another time. But this is a process too where Indigenous people are able to kind of come into public space, make interventions on the kind of violent colonial structures that really inform the ways that you can move in the downtown area, right? And kind of reassert Indigenous presence in these territories and reassert relationships with land. So this felt like an opportunity, especially because it's an ephemeral space. These are construction hoardings. This was on, these have been all over the campus and getting covered in their own kind of like ad hoc forms of public space intervention for a while now. So since they're temporary, I was hoping that some artists would try to experiment with some techniques that they hadn't tried before, or especially with Q, I was like, well, I really want someone who already knows what they're doing to come and try to show us what to do first. I think the spray painting and learning everything that went into just holding the can right and making a mark with this kind of aerosol, that was interesting for me. I was really happy to participate, because the other thing was, I wasn't just doing this as a curator, I really wanted to learn how to do spray painting and wheat pasting. That's what we do sometimes. So here you can see, I love this picture, you can see some of towards the end of the project when we had finished up with some of these projects. So there's the Onaman Collective, Kristi Belcourt's design, Mother Earth Revolution. This is one of the references that I was really interested in, because Kristi Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch as Onaman Collective have been so important as the kind of image makers for a movement recently, right? So since Standing Rock, they've been creating images that came to them, especially through dream and through collaborative practice in those traditional image sourcing ways, right? They create images and make them open source, available to movements, especially land defense and environmental protection movements, for Indigenous communities that were facing their own struggles against extractive industry, against land theft, things like that. So on their website, Onaman Collective, you will find all those kind of posters, and they do kind of silk screening workshops. But those posters are also really useful for making posters and wheat pasting them up and just making interventions in public space. I've seen them applied large scale on streets in front of banks, for instance, right? In part of the protests for, I think it was was it the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or maybe it was Standing Rock? But these kinds of things, these kinds of images that can grow and change to suit urban environments and further these kinds of social projects, those are really interesting to me. So I was experimenting with some of those. We experimented with some of those stenciling techniques for this, and I think it moved on to different techniques. And I think Maria showed an image before where they were making those stencils together, right? And trying to figure that out together. It was really cool to see you guys all figure that out together. And then I could watch and see what actually worked and be like, okay. Yeah. I think so. They transitioned from the stenciling to more of the freehand application once the fists were up there. That was really interesting. It was also interested to see the development of Susan Blight's project there. So you can see that in the middle one. That took a surprisingly long time. It was kind of almost a textile-like process where we had orange and blue stickers, and we were tiling them onto this surface and learning about this new kind of material, these biodegradable stickers. We're used to seeing stickers as interventions in public space, of course. These ones are biodegradable, sort of helping us move away from reliance on plastics, right? But so they've held up pretty well, eh? haven't been by this site in a couple of months, but I think aside from falling off, those stickers are holding up really interesting, but they will eventually degrade into the environment without causing too adverse an impact. It did take a lot of time and collaboration to kind of get those all up going, though. I think that was there was a time when it was all surrounded by a team just putting those all the way across. That was interesting. And behind that, you can see a little bit a piece that was brought to us by a basket maker from Aquasofner. So I think that that Carrie Hill there, she's brought those basket making techniques and did something she hadn't tried before. This was one of the things I was hoping to do too with this project, is kind of take Indigenous artists who are working in very different kinds of arts economies and try to give them a space to experiment with a large scale arts they haven't really tried before. My background and my kind of curatorial aim generally is to try to bridge some of these different arts economies, because I find I've started out, I got my start career-wise. I had actually just finished my Bachelor of Fine Arts at Concordia, and I had no idea what to do. So I went back home and started working at my tribal museum. Working at the tribal museum as the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation as a curatorial assistant, kind of working with artists to kind of put up their shows and trying to develop their practices. I got really familiar with this kind of intersection that's more common in our more remote communities, which is the intersection between what people call craft work and the fine arts, right? Or what's termed the fine arts, and how different those economies can be, but how much they intersect for especially Indigenous and marginalized communities, right? So basket makers, quill workers, bead workers, I worked a lot with those ladies, mostly ladies, and it became really important for me to kind of open up the kinds of larger opportunities that I saw happening in gallery spaces to those kinds of artists working. So I was really interested to bring Carrie out to take these very material, very land-based skills and try to see what we could do with them. I think her project was one of the more challenging and more taxing for our artist assistants to make that bridging happen between the artists, what the artist had in mind, and the skills that the artist brought, and to try to make that into a sort of more finished collaborative mural project. I thought it was really interesting, though. I learned a lot, and about how to kind of proceed on those kinds of things again. But I do see in my role, I do want to create those bridges between these art world economies and make sure that our artists, especially artists like myself, and I think some of the other collaborators on the project, who are coming from this background of kind of formal arts education, to be able to make connections with artists who are not coming from that same kind of direction, right? It is important for us to be able to make relationships that are not always dependent or not always kind of structured by the academy, by the professionalism of commercial galleries and commercial endeavors, and kind of especially making this kind of curatorial making these things possible. It is a lot of work, and I recognize that it did take a lot of on the part of the artist helpers to bring that to life. I do think it's worth it, though. I thought we come out with some really interesting things. What have we got on our next slide? I think I just want to talk briefly. Yeah, this was the one of our wheat pasting experiments. It continues to evade us how to wheat paste something that won't be delicious to the little critters of the elements. But this was probably one of the more fun processes we did together. I love working with the printouts that you then paste up. It's so satisfying. So we continue to work on that solution. Here, I just wanted to highlight the kind of the logic of the title for the show. I guess the tree protection zone. When Maria Hupfield and I were thinking about this project initially, tree protection zone sounded funny to us. It was a term that we plucked right from the postings that were on the construction hoardings themselves, the postings that said tree protection zone that explained why these trees had hoardings on them, right? It's actually just a construction business term for the hoardings that go around trees, tree protection zone. We thought that was so funny. It was posted on the hoardings because especially like in Indigenous worlds just then, land protection and the kind of idea that the idea of protesters, especially protesters who are engaged in kind of roadblocks and engaged in these kinds of resistance camp, that protesters are protectors. That was a really big part of the discourse in Indigenous circles just then. So we were just laughing at the idea that these hoardings were protectors for these trees. We thought it was nice, though. I feel like there was some connections there that we wanted to draw out too. So this idea of there's a tree protection zone. So how else can we assert a zone, a space where this kind of protector work happens? Protector here having the kind of connotations of protester, right? So land protection zone, kin protection zone, life protection zone. So these are kinds of some of the things that I think the artists in this larger project are speaking to. It's not just to do with kind of the conservation of the natural. It has to do with the kind of renewal of our relationship with lands, with spaces, especially in an urban environment, right? So that's what that's about. I think that's all I have to say for now. And I think that I'd like to bring it back around to, I have a couple of questions for our artists and our helpers to get us started on this conversation here. Just to get a quick time check from our organizers here, we have until 3, is that correct?
We have until 2:45 to open for
2:45.
questions.
Okay, wonderful. So we have some time. I think the first thing I would really like to talk to, I was wondering if people could speak to the difference between what they see as the formal elements of their education, right? And the influence of these kind of more informal networks, right? These kind of arts relationships or people you learned from more laterally. So I think we're coming from some different contexts in that regard. Some of us went to art school. Some of us learned things outside of art school that we brought into our practice. And just where you say you learned your most essential skills from. So maybe we'll start with Q on that.
For me, like my foundation is being Anishinaabe. That lifestyle in general is my backbone. Like that's the whole thing. But I think hip hop has to be the most influential in Western culture, and because it's like an orally passed on tradition, it felt very natural to me to pick that up and adapt to that. And hip hop has a lot of really cool sayings, like each one teach one, pass the torch. There's a lot of cool, like almost like.
Could you explain real quick? Each one teach one.
Like each one teach one was a term that we would use when we would we were taught. First, when I'm talking about hip hop, I'm not like, talking about hip hop from the suburbs, being from like a family that's like, I grew up in the Bronx before I came to Toronto, and I've always kept a really tight relationship with my mentors, my family that's out there. And so I learned hip hop from the pioneers of this culture, like the Zulu Kings. That's the first like b-boy crew ever, and they started around 1976. So they're part of that fundamental backbone of the foundation. And their whole thing was that we were there to like essentially separate ourselves from being part of these gangs and put ourselves into an environment that was about peace, love, unity, and having fun. And when we did these art forms, we were allowed to challenge each other, just like a fight. However, we weren't allowed to touch each other. And the winner will be determined by who has the best skills. And it's a very like challenging art form, like you never hear of like Picasso battling Salvador Dali or nothing like that. You know what I'm saying? Like hip hop is all based on battling. And it's based on like, it's very much street culture based. So I learned everything orally from my mentors by seeking them. And back then when I was learning, like there was no internet yet. I had to literally walk, take a subway, sometimes risk my life just to learn a dance move from somebody, because that's just the way it is in New York. And so yeah, for me, it's hip hop culture as my main influence for those reasons.
That's really cool. I wonder, I'll ask Maria next if you want to reflect on your academic development or your influences.
Yeah, I would say I did my undergrad at OCAD in drawing and painting. And throughout that time, I was really exploring different materials as well. Bronze casting, working with metals, and mold making, like different techniques. I think materiality is something that I'm really passionate about, as well as just standing close to people in general, just being in conversation, being inside like groups, which has taken me to different residencies in Spain, France, and Germany, right prior to the pandemic. And I was working in artist residencies where sometimes I would share space, living space. We would sleep, eat, make, create, all of that in these spaces. So that really made me kind of think about the ways I interact in my hometown, home spaces, like why I don't do the same. So when I returned and was given the opportunity to think about the positions that I would take up, I wanted to merge kind of my artist life and my working life. I have been managing in retail spaces for visual merchandising, working with spaces, how to interpret it for commercial needs, which kind of took I guess I hit a limit with working in those spaces in terms of satisfying my artistic career and feeling like I belonged in the artist community. And so when this opportunity of being a coordinator for a short time to test it out came about, it was like perfect for me to see if those skills would align for the project. And it surprisingly has. So I'm so thankful for being able to actually work for and with other artists. I think in terms of skill sharing, it's like one thing to learn about it online or in books, and then to actually touch it and see someone else work with it. So I think whether in the school setting or outdoors, just bringing yourself closer to actually seeing and touching and working through processes and methods is another way of learning that is kind of building a body memory to those things. I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe I'll expand afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think that idea of body memory is a really cool place to kind of connect with what Kristi was talking about, because Kristi, I know that you were talking about learning basketry that came through your family, but online, right? So this idea of body memory and recovery, it would have been a different experience for you, right?
Sure, yeah. It's pretty interesting with my experience. Actually, before I started the basketry and the weaving during COVID, I was in school as well. I was in OCAD, and I actually did furniture design for a bit. And before that, I did a lot of mold making molds for sculptures. And I think going into a process like basketry is really interesting because mold making and woodworking, those processes can be pretty fast. And with basketry is kind of like meditation, it's very slow, but like you see kind of it growing. And with woodworking, it's like, oh, you cut things to size and you join it and put it together and it's done in 3 days. And I think comparing both of those processes is really interesting for me. And just and yeah, with like the experience of me being in school, I think a lot of the very valuable advice and tips that I've gotten were from not actually working in the classroom, but just being in the studio and talking to other students and talking to the people who work in the studios, because they have so much knowledge of these like machines and like processes and techniques. And I think that's really important as well, because that really goes out of, it really carries through you in school and out of school as well, because I still have these connections of these people outside of school. I think it's always good to have like your network of people at school that are really passionate and want to achieve more outside of the school context. And yeah, like just me just also working at school during when I was a student, I was a shop monitor as well. So I was able to kind of give other students a hand in just in their projects. And they can also like give me different ideas as well. Like I also soak up some of the students' knowledge. I mean, I'm a monitor, but I also want to learn from the students as well. So when I see other people's creative processes, it's really interesting to see how they work in their ways and how I could be an assistant to them. And yeah, now I work as a class assistant here. As you can see, I'm in the office of the sculpture installation studio. And it's just so nice to see just new students coming in and having these ideas of making. And especially in this studio that I'm working at, any medium is possible. And I actually make my baskets here too. So when I do weave in the studio as well, like students would come in and be like, oh, what is this medium? I've never seen this. They're like, oh, it's a basket. Oh, cool. Like, I really want to learn that. And I think it really, me working on my own projects and helping other students give other opportunities to students to see what possibilities there are in their making skills too. So yeah, and that one, it's really great.
That's actually really interesting. So I feel like that studio experience and being a helper in the studio or being a studio coordinator, that seems like a way that that's knowledge sharing and that kind of art relationships among artists really happens. I remember when I was in my undergrad and doing all that studio, kind of in the studio was a place of connection for me. I found that I really struggled trying to make connections with other students and others, because everyone was very focused on their own project or they had their own kind of thought process going on. So I kind of really struggled to make connections between others, because mostly I found what I was doing was talking with them about my work. We were talking with them. So the studio was the only place where we were kind of like watching each other work and you could kind of connect on that level. The thing is, so I didn't actually make I feel like my time in undergrad wasn't very, I didn't create very long lasting relationships. Because I was working on my own projects, it was only when I became involved in curatorial work and started coordinating other people's projects, started working with the beadworking ladies and trying to make other people's work really kind of like shine and try to focus on them. When I'm put in a helper role, that's when those kinds of relationships really started, and I started learning from them. And then my work started, I could kind of come back into conversation with theirs. I found that interesting. So I was wondering if we could actually go around and just speak to a little bit more. Where are the sites for you guys that you find that those collaborative relationships happen? Right? For me, I tried to make them in the studio, but it didn't really happen for me. But it did happen when I started working on other people's work. So I wonder if we go around again. Whoever wants to start, have an idea about where they find those relationships started for them. Q, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, no problem. I think my approach has always been about like being very like a representation of like who I am when I meet people. So I try to just be really like, positive in all my interactions. And one of my mentors gave me some really good advice about making sure I never said no to any good opportunity, no matter how big or how small. He just said, always say yes, just like, and trust the process. I think that was two big advices that were given that were really huge for me. So I'm always been taking the approach to like, just develop with people. And I'm really excited about synergy, like the collective of someone bringing out something in me and vice versa, and complementing each other. With the design that I did for the hoardings, I never did anything like that before. Like that was like the first time I had done anything what I consider political. And it had a strong message, and it was something that really resonated to me. And, I just through my opportunities being able to take me to that position, that created an opportunity that was, if the ripple effect was, if I would have said no to your invitations, I would have not gotten the invitation to do the Daniels building, because the results is that I realized that I can create different style of art that didn't have to be like what you see behind me, which was what I was trying to do to the woodland style. I was trying to make the woodland style dance, and I still am, but I'm realizing that I can do more. So I've always had the approach to like learn from people, like my mentors, and learn from everyone. Like I'm very observant. I like to see how people get things done. Doesn't matter how they do it. I just appreciate the process, and yeah, that's my answer.
I think going on with what Q was saying about opportunities, I think that's really important. You have to take any opportunity that you can. I think as an artist right now, trying to have like a starting emerging artist career, just apply to anything that you see as well. I've applied to so many things, and most of the time I only get like 1 or 2 calls to do an art project. So I just feel like with a new upcoming artist, just apply to any opportunity you see on Akimbo or whatever you see on the social media. And even with your friends too, if they want to collaborate, just give it a shot, try it. It's always a good experience. I've had very good experiences with working with other artists, and even just applying to numerous different applications. And I think also for just where I got sort of like where I started with these connections and stuff. Yes, I did it through school, but I think residencies are nice as well. I did an online residency with Roundtable at first. So that was really interesting, but I still made a lot of connections even through an online platform. And with my first in-person residency with Xspace, it was really nice to get to see other artists and get a lot of advice and feedback from the people who are working in the center as well, since they have a lot of experience with their own art practices and with exhibition work. There's a lot to learn from these mentors that are there in this space. And I think with the TPZ project, that is a really good example as well. I got quite good opportunities after that project has ended, especially with this position that I am in right now. I think with the TPZ project, it really helped me get to this point, working at the school, especially getting that experience with the Hart House. And yeah, I'm just ongoing with other exhibitions that I've been doing. Just having the more experiences you have, the more doors that will open to you. So yeah, you might.
Yeah, I could add to that. I think opportunities, but also being like really aware of your own interests. That took me a long time to really pay attention to. And I think I was just questioning like at what point does collaboration happen in a relationship? These are some, like I'm someone with a lot of questions. And so I was just thinking through that moment when you decide to stand beside or work with or alongside an idea or a process to come up with new ways of kind of ending at a different point from what you would have done by yourself. So yeah, collaborations for me, I think, happen in a lot of discussions. And really, it starts with conversations and sparking up those moments where it's like, oh, you're interested in that. I am too, or I'm working through this. Oh, okay, you have another way of problem solving it. Just having these momentary opportunities to maybe work together or find ways to help each other. I feel like I'm really onto relationships that are, as I think Sean Jinwright recently had said, like rather than transactional, like transformative experiences. And I really agreed to that statement in terms of what places and what am I investing myself into in terms of transformative experiences and moments, even if they seem very short, because your body and your mind will carry that forward with you. So yeah, that's all that I had to add to that.
I feel free to jump in, you guys, if you have another thought. We don't have to like go according to my schedule or whatever. But I do want to ask too, because we were working. This project happened during the pandemic. Kristi, I know you've done a lot of collaborative work in pandemic conditions. I am kind of curious to know if anyone, well, if you guys have any stories of working, trying to make collaborations work. How do we make these relationships work when we're so far apart sometimes? Kristi, I do want to hear about you, how you did several collaborative works
Yeah.
in the pandemic.
Sure. Yeah, which is like during the pandemic. Yeah. I feel like it was interesting during the pandemic, especially that you don't have that in-person, experience. I did a lot of the collaborations at first online with my peers, and then we just talk about ideas and our projects and what we want to put forth in like the exhibition. And then afterwards we kind of just like met outside at a park and just experimented with different ways of like weaving and working with the materials that we just had in our household or outside in the park. We would just like grab different twigs or whatever and just try and weave something with it, just experiment. Yeah, I think in the pandemic it was a bit tricky, but I think just trying to make time to come together is really important, making sure everyone's in like the same page and just coming in the same schedule. I think one thing that was interesting about the pandemic too is I guess like my peers were probably less busy because there was like less going on in the pandemic, so we were able to really just talk about our ideas and where we wanted to go forth with our point of views and our projects and things like that. And yeah, I think I would have to say it was pretty hard actually, just because there's not a lot of there's a lot of limitations and just everything just has to be done online. I feel like communication's a little bit harder online. Yeah, especially if it is a collaborative thing. I think it's easier to talk in person, but we try to make both of those situations happen, like in person and online. I think at some point got sick of like doing it online. We're like, no, we gotta meet in person. Like this is not really working out, especially if it's such a medium that requires physicality.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like weaving and doing sculptures, you kind of need to sort of be there in person to see how it looks. So that was a little, tricky to just show on like camera, like, hey, this is what it looks like. I'm like, I have no perspective of it. I gotta like see it in person. So yeah, that was the tricky part of it. Yeah. But yeah, we try not to like rush things as well. Try to like take things one at a time. I think that's an important thing. Like, don't treat it as like a competition. There's no rush with everything. If you take your time with things and do things one at a time, then usually there's a better outcome with that.
Time is an interesting thing. I've been thinking about like the human pace versus like internet pace.
Yeah,
and,
like online is so fast.
Or recent adaptation, like adapting back to like physical spaces and physical meetings and how long it takes actually to get to places and be prepared for those interactions. But my experience with the pandemic was that I was doing a mural project with 14 other artists on site right after the first lockdown for a site in Mississauga. And I was super excited to just be outdoors because those were the spaces that were being offered up as project spaces. And so I think that was the first time I was really excited about the studio space being in a public space. Like I had done public art before, but it was like a moment where it was like really meaningful and like something that I needed actually in that moment. So when I actually arrived on the site, you could never have all the artists on site at one time. So the interactions that I had were dependent on the count of people rather than the project itself. And so the ways we maneuvered through a project timeline was so different from what we were used to. And the appreciation for that kind of like weaving of people coming and going, I think became very visible to me. I also did like another public project that was video based, and it had been proposed as like a project that would follow the favorite spaces of artists in the city. And unfortunately, during the actual shooting of that project, it was that those spaces were closed during another lockdown. So, you know, I was alone in those spaces, which is very different from capturing like activity. And so I think what is left from documenting that through artist projects that are public facing, maybe not now, but eventually, hopefully, bring up moments of other realizations of how we reacted to this kind of sudden change in time.
Yeah, I think I really did want to have all of our artists on the TVZ project be able to work, like at least like be working at the same time. I think that was one of the limitations we had to work around with the pandemic, right? Was that we could only really work one artist at a time or bring so many people into the space at a time. And it was outdoors, so that helped things a bit. But I still want to be able to get us together. Maybe we could have a virtual get together, but working while you can see each other working is a totally different experience than kind of coming after the fact and seeing the whole effect. And then Q, I'm not sure Q's been able to see after the finished product.
Not yet, but definitely planning on going to like in spring once it's a little bit nicer. Maybe next week. I heard it's gonna be really nice. So.
Whoa, yours is still bright as ever.
Nice.
Yeah, there was a moment, I think a few months ago, where shoes were left by your hoarding, children's shoes. Someone had put one pair and then it grew to a few pairs, and then it snowed and they disappeared on us. But just a response to those hoardings were quite visible.
I had this really nice message from like someone random who saw the artwork, and he was afraid that the tree was coming down, and he had a connection to the tree with him and his grandmother, and she had passed away. And like he was really worried that the tree was going to be like, he thought they were taking it down. So he got really upset, and then he kind of like did some research, saw the artwork, and realized you know, that the tree was being protected and it was okay. And then he just sent me a nice message because he really liked the message of the boards itself too. So I thought that was kind of a cool like interaction. Yeah, I normally don't typically get people reaching out to me and telling me like, you know, how that like their story and how I got connected to them through my art. So but to go back onto the pandemic thing, for me, like I just wanted to I wanted to share a little bit like how it affected me, because I used to travel everywhere for in terms of like my career. I had a whole career in the hip hop community around the world, and what I was doing is I was traveling around, going to different places that were really hot spots for hip hop culture, like Japan, Korea, China, all over Europe. And I was teaching events. I was teaching workshops. I was creating events. I was being a judge. I was doing showcases. I was performing. Like I was like the one-stop hip hop shop, but I was traveling with my crew, and we essentially were taking tours and taking turns doing tours. And when the pandemic struck, I had nothing. I couldn't go anywhere. And literally I watched all my networks just disappear. And so the pandemic is the reasons why I became more directed into painting murals and designing and working out of Toronto, because I was based out of Toronto, but I was working everywhere else. I was just kind of like using Toronto as like, because it's an international airport, was one of the main reasons why I decided to stay in Toronto, because I can fly anywhere in the world from this airport. So I was really like attached to the convenience of, you know, being able to just fly from here. So, but the pandemic had a huge influence on me being, you know, going towards painting murals. And the program that I'm part of, that I graduated from, that street art program at the city Street Art Toronto, that was the reason why I had like, I guess I consider, you know, I've had like a fairly successful past 2 years or 3 years since the pandemic started, because I just jumped 100% all my, you know, eggs in one basket with street art, and it just opened doors after doors after doors. And yeah, that's how the pandemic affected me.
Yeah, I do find too, I relate with what you said about the pandemic kind of grounded some of my projects. Like, I mean, when in that period where I wasn't going anywhere and I couldn't bring anyone here, my focus really tightened, and then I really had to start working with people who were like right near me, right? So you kind of, it narrows your focus to who's around you, and I think it became productive that way. I do feel like we skipped over a little bit. Q, I don't know if we explained the significance, actually. We alluded to the kind of political nature of your design for the TVZ project, but I was wondering if you could connect that a little bit more, and how that design was connecting to stuff that was going on at that time in your communities.
Well, that was a combination of like a whole bunch of things in that design. The attraction for me was I was going to paint something different that I've never done before. And that was the first idea that I put inside to make sure that I stuck to, was like, okay, let's do something we haven't done. And I'm Anishinaabe, and I've always known about residential schools. I've always known about covenant houses. I've always known about just the constant colonization, oppression, extreme poverty that our people live through. And growing up on a reserve, I lived with it firsthand. And with the significance of what I was trying to do was take the attention of what had happened at the Kamloops residential school, where the announcement was of the 215 children were discovered. And then afterwards, the domino effect of all the other children that were being discovered one after another. And what I wanted to do was I thought that because it was a place where there were going to be, it was the future minds, you know, for me, that's what I look at. The University of Toronto is the future. And I thought I wanted to kind of like create what they would be seeing all the time, is themselves in lineups, wearing their backpacks, you know, going to school and learning. Except for the meaning behind mine mural, that design is that the children that lined up for residential school, they had that same feeling inside. They thought they were going to go learn. They thought they were going to go to a real school. And instead of them going to school, they went to the spirit world. And it's showing the children lining up, walking in from all ages, from like kindergarten all the way to high school. And I have direct family that was affected by, you know, those war crimes against my people. And I have my stepmom, June, who went to Spanish, which is a residential school here in Ontario. And my mom went to a covenant house, and that's an all nun school. And yeah, it's horrific what had happened to them. The stories that I've heard, the abuse, the torture, you know, the punishment for being Indigenous. And so that the mural itself was to create a healing visual experience. So when people came, they walked around in a circle, which is the Anishinaabe way of thinking, circular thinking it's called. And it's through the medicine wheel where we use these approaches, where we learn and understand how nature's working around us and how we can harmonize ourselves with nature. And so the design wasn't to just like create a historical piece that's like based off of like, you know, historical, you know, facts. I didn't want to just make it like, I wanted it to have like more multiple meanings with everyone. I wanted everyone to get a different experience, but essentially I wanted it all to kind of like be a learning experience and then a healing experience. And so if you walk around the entire circle, it kind of like tells you a story of how we came from the woodlands, blocked and stood in line, and there was no more trees, and we went straight into the spirit world. And next to the children where they're going into the spirit world is kind of like the Turtle Island story. And in the actual mural, I put like sacred geometry. I included the patterns of the 7 grandfather teachings, the 13 grandmother clan system, essentially like our lunar calendar, and our medicine wheel, and some of the historical like teachings about North America being Turtle Island, and how the first human was a woman and her name was Winona, and having that whole history and that whole story being implemented, and just wanting to like, you know, not oversaturate the message, but puts enough in there where it gets everyone, it resonates with everyone. And yeah, that's the story behind that piece.
It was really, I think it was really attractive to people walking by. I think that of all the projects, that was the project that got the most people coming by and saying, "Oh my God, this is beautiful. What are you doing?" I do remember people coming up during that one. I'm curious too, if you, at the time, Q, if you saw other kinds of public space interventions, or like, for me, this Every Child Matters movement and that grieving process after the discovery at the Kamloops School was really visible in all these, in the banners and the kind of the gifts being left at like Queen's Park and stuff, all these memorials to the children that were being left. I felt that that was a way that it became really present. And it's interesting to hear that some shoes did pop up. So for those who aren't aware, the children's shoes being left became one of these kinds of ways of memorializing those missing children, right? Those children who weren't able to be with us anymore. So at various sites, you would see these concentric circles of shoes. There was one at the Ryerson Monument, before and after. So there was one here on campus, with the mural. I wonder where they went.
Yeah, they grew in number and then are gone now. But you know, just working alongside Q and these stories, like I just started my grad school at OCAD, and the research, it really influenced the way I research, because I work with Korean narrative like Han as an affect word, but like intergenerational trauma is something that I really look into. And the ways we talk about truth, reconciliation, colonial, like dealing with systems and structures, and what that means to me, like in my everyday life, and how do I practice that, and how do I stay involved and aware. I think working alongside those who are directly impacted is one way of being really, more aware than just reading. So I like the intersections that these projects bring to that research, and like building my own kind of ways of being a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think I'm interested too in how because it became this site of public memory in that way too, right? So not only your mural, but these kinds of different ways, these shoes being left around, these banners that are put up on those barriers in public spaces. Seeing the life of those was really interesting for me. So I know our project was ephemeral to begin with, but for a long time, and during the project too, I was seeing posters, especially I was seeing wheat pasting, I was seeing stickers, I was seeing graffiti on other hoardings around campus that was also speaking to the Every Child Matters movement and to different social and political issues. Those things get taken down very quickly. So I would come back next day, and like the poster with this with the image of this one child, I remember very starkly a poster with an image of a child had already been half taken down, and then it was probably, I think, facilities just goes around and takes them down and paints over them pretty regularly on campus. It's such an environment, I think, on campus here that is so controlled, and so even kind of these interventions kind of wash away so regularly. So it's powerful to have something that is enduring, right? That is being cultivated and cared for instead of being erased.
I was just thinking about the conversations we were having on site with when we were doing Shubhanai Shuna's mural by the cannons and the cannons. Yeah, and like just really visibly having that on the site right beside us. I think Kristi could also speak to it, how our conversations kind of grew. Our kind of awareness of those structures being there grew to this kind of uneasy, uncomfortable state in a way, and then how to work around it or work with that as a way of opening up how we understand that site. Even when we were doing the title hoarding with the protection letters, there was like a digging that was happening right beside it. And it was just weird to see like land protection, the words come up, but then like a digging, of course, it's other reasons, but just, I don't know, it heightened my senses to like another degree. But.
I think that was interesting that you, the cannons that were on site. I love how we were discussing the idea of actually covering it, or like
working with it.
Working with it and just making it a completely different thing, because it really should not be there at all, especially with the hoardings that are that we're putting up. I remember the time where you were painting Shuvani's mural. You actually sat on it and then you were like rolling the paint on the top. I still have that photo, which I thought was really funny. But just, you know, the discussion of the historical concept of the space before we were putting the hoardings on, I think is like it's really interesting in the sense that like U of T has been a very old institution for a long time in Toronto, and it has these sort of colonial ties to the colonial history and ties to our structures, and even till this day it still has some of that remnants into the education system and the site itself. And just having, I think it's really refreshing to see these hoardings just be on that site, because there's people walking around these parks all the time. And when I was like working on these hoardings, people would usually ask like, oh, what is this? Like, is it just art pieces? Like, they look really nice. And I'm like, no, there's actually a lot of meaning behind these hoardings. Like, they're not just, you know, pretty things that you just see and cross and just look at. There's a lot of, even painful history behind these hoardings that we have to address to the public. And I think it's actually really nice that's in a public space, because it's so accessible for everyone to see it and for everyone to engage with it. So for me, I think that, me being a studio assistant working outside and getting a bit of context of what U of T was before, and now having these hoardings here, generated a lot of really interesting conversation with the public. And, also opened my eyes to seeing like, like works in these site specific places are really important, and there needs to be a lot of context behind it. It's like just the art piece. And this has really helped me develop my thoughts into my public art piece that's going to be in Elora, especially since I'm weaving a really tall structure. It's actually going to be like 5 feet tall, and having my dad's narrative to be a part of it, to me, in a space where it has a lot of colonial history behind it, is very interesting, especially as a person who is an immigrant, displaying it there. It's a very interesting context for sure.
And Barbara had asked in the chat if we felt that we connected with people, getting to know others who are walking by, or was it a different way of experiencing the audience? If anyone wants to expand on that.
I definitely got to know a lot of people while I was there every day. Several people would come up to me, not at the same time, but individually, just either show me their appreciation or have any questions. Luckily, it wasn't for directions. It was just like about the painting, but it was a good experience. That's one of the gratifying feelings that I really appreciate when I'm out there, is that, like I grew up on graffiti and I never got any kind of positive, there was no positive enforcement of what I'm doing. It was always like, when are you going to grow up and stop doing this? More like that kind of, acknowledgement. So being able to go into a community knowing that I have a positive effect and that I can create something that resonates with someone, that allows them to feel like they're safe, or allows them to feel like they belong somewhere, or allows them to feel that they're acknowledged. There's so many different things. For me, art isn't like just based on style. To me, like I have like, there's a commitment to my culture about the visual healing experience. Like that's always has to resonate in my, and when I'm working in the city, like trying to do designs and stuff. I have my own personal stuff. I still do graffiti on the side of, I'm constantly practicing the art forms in hip hop, but knowing that when you go to a wall and people come up to you and they're so impacted, like I've had people offer me coffees and offer me lunch and, just being really generous about me going into the community and them thanking me, saying, really appreciate what I've done. And it's a really cool experience, versus where I came from. That's for sure.
One thing I also want to actually say about the hoardings is the hoarding and like just public art spaces in general is I think like representation is like very important, especially in a space where historically it didn't have a lot of representation, to just be able to speak our narratives through these works and to sort of educate the public about, I guess, who we are or like what our culture is about is a very sort of important way to communicate and to have a better mutual understanding with each other.
Yeah, and there's an interesting encounter with the campus security when a couple of us actually went back to the site to do some maintenance work. We were doing the wheat pasting, and they drove by and just stopped and were like, "Are you supposed to be doing that?" And it was just like this moment of interaction of like, what is what artists do on site. So I really enjoy those moments where there is an aha, like a moment of realizing, oh, it is meant to be here, and having that discussion. But we also had another photographer come on site and ask if they could do a durational kind of archiving project and see it through the different seasons. So I'm not sure how that project is going, but I think the fact that the sites and the stories that were brought to the sites creates a sense of like wanting to come back and return to is another layer that's really wonderful. And to see how time changes the forms and the meanings behind all of it. Just wonder like the temporality of it, if it seems like something that is momentary or how long lasting it is.
The temporality is interesting, yeah. And I think the temporality of the site and this kind of like this in-between state, this kind of transformational state is something that's really interesting. And I do think it's an interesting contrast with the kinds of work that I'm pretty familiar with, that I think Indigenous artists typically have become familiar with working with, are these kind of interventions on the sites. Like, oh, can you respond to like the John A. MacDonald statue? Can you do this response? Can you do this response? We are so often in the position of doing these kinds of, these later additions, these kinds of fixes to the existing structures, right? To kind of work around those structures that exist there. I just going to put that out there, that that's an interesting position to be in all the time, right? So the fact that these are interventions that are going to go away, and that well, like even things like the cannons, those colonial statues that are still in our spaces, like we were right across from King Edward there. Like those things are this kind of unquestioned presence, that there's not even kind of like a potential for seeing those moved, even if it does come to be a case where you've got a bunch of cannons in the middle of an Indigenous art installation, and no, of course we can't move them. There is definitely an ongoing kind of rupture there, I think. So that's interesting. Also, on the topic of that, of our little brushes with the campus police, I think it's important also just to kind of flag that these campus spaces are not quite public spaces, right? These aren't public spaces. These are very carefully policed, very carefully sanitized private university spaces. And we kind of had an encounter with that, and being authorized to be there, it was one thing. I have had other experiences on campus where you basically try to be brown on campus and do something creative, and you'll get the cops called on you, like at New College, where they were trying to build a lodge, a teaching lodge on New College, and immediately that starts happening. They're like, you get the cops called on you, which is always interesting. Of course, it'll be like, it's easy to kind of explain and be like, no, we're supposed to be here, but just the fact there's this constant surveillance that's there. And I do think we found like there's evidence in the site itself of how the site continually excludes people that shouldn't be there, how these kind of hierarchies, these spatial hierarchies are maintained. I think it makes more stark the ways that these kinds of projects, these kinds of ways of working together in these spaces are so important, right? Like learning how to be together and do these kinds of projects in a space that is authorized, but I think that it prepares us for kind of being able to occupy space more strategically, right? Maybe I'll give one example of ways I think that the campus itself is kind of designed to facilitate kind of that exclusion. Is like even just on the hoardings themselves. You know how they've got that window cut in them, right? That's so that campus police are able to surveil people who might be taking shelter in those areas. And we did have evidence of people like sleeping bags, abandoned sleeping bags, or ways that people had tried to kind of take shelter inside one of the hoardings. And I think it is down to kind of this sort of securitized area that we never actually saw the people themselves, that those signs of life are all that were left. So I do think it's interesting that the traces were there anyway, right? We have one question from, Charlotte's got a question for us. How did the specific site, the university, Queen's Park, Tattle Creek of the hoardings inform the content of the murals? All right, and what's gonna happen to them once they come down? Yeah, let's talk about that, what we got. I'd love to hear, about how the specific site informed the content of the murals.
I think every artist had their take on how to respond to the site. I think one thing about public art is that you are responding and you are kind of engaged with the encounters that will happen with the community who visits the site. I think like Susan Blight really responded with Tattle Creek and did a topography image of that creek, and that became the design. And building an awareness of what is below, that is unseen or invisible. And right across from her work, okay, yes, there are the designs there. And Carrie Hill also brought images of hands and shoes and the water and the message of lands back. And she was really excited to work on a hoarding around an indigenous species or trees, right? So it was really important for her to select that, whether the audience was aware of those decisions or not. I think in terms of building that awareness of water, Mick, you brought in the Ottoman Collective's designs and posters for us to really build that relationship to the actual sites and the hidden waterways. And then Nils Elu Watakerlik, a poet and an illustrator. It was their first time working with photographs that they had actually taken in Norway, and the story, responding to a story of healing that was meant for the site. So not only the specific site, but also the stories that were being revealed and visible in media and also in the news, I think really influenced the designs. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, for Carrie especially, she was interested. She was like, are any of the trees our indigenous relations? And actually that was the only one. I feel like there might have been, the maple tree might have been a North American variety. The other ones are kind of trees we're familiar with, but they're European varieties and they're really good for shade. They're kind of the things that fit within the university's idea of what nature is, you know, in this kind of urban environment. So the white pine was what Carrie chose as her tree. It wasn't the most prominent, it was actually the most tucked away. It was kind of difficult to work with. But she explained that the pine tree, the white pine in Akwesasne, where she's from, I think they use, it's different trees in the traditions of different Mohawk communities, but that's the world tree in their oral tradition. That's the tree whose branches spread out over everyone else. And she says, I think I would love to create a hoarding, something to protect and like speak to that tree, and also talk about the tree as a protector. That was cool. I was thinking too about, so we spoke to Tidal Creek, the idea that the hoardings, we thought we were all wondering why they were so large, right? Like, well, are they worried that someone's going to bump into the tree trunks? So the hoardings themselves are supposed to protect the roots, right? We often forget about what happens underneath, which is why I love your mushroom piece there, Kristi. The underworld, being able to see what's under the ground.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I know. It was interesting. We're like, oh, we're going to get into this project. We're only focusing on the underneath of the tree, but that's just such an important part for the tree to grow and to nurture everything that's around it. So it was a really interesting project to take up for sure. Yeah. But yeah, I'm curious about that question now. What happens with it when they all come down? Like, I actually don't know.
But the idea is that the artists come and have first, we're going to cut them up and the artist can take them. I think somebody's got dibs on one for the hockey rink for their, for the hockey rink. But we're not entirely sure. The thing about this site is that it's a construction site, so a lot of the production has happened on the construction site schedule. So we're not exactly sure when we can go and get those. But when that happens this summer, the artists will come get them. And then if they don't have a use for them, anyone can come get them. We had another question that we kind of skipped over as well. Vinicio asked, Kristi already talked about it a little bit, but could each of you elaborate on the relationship between working on an Indigenous art installation with an institution like U of T, which is a really interesting question. I don't know. Hugh, do you have any thoughts on like working on an Indigenous art piece in a space like U of T or that institutional relationship?
I think it's important for any visibility, any kind of chance to share our culture and create that awareness that we're still here, that the narrative of us being extinct or us being a lost cause or any of that stuff, just kind of like all that being cleared and showing like, hey, Indigenous culture is still striving, it's still here, and giving people an opportunity to learn that there are many different Indigenous tribes. And that's, it's especially at a place like U of T, because it's considered to be like the elite university in Canada. Like, I think like for people to see Native culture being showcased is important. That's the way I look at it, I don't really get involved into politics. I'm not really like educated in that, so I would never talk about anything I don't know. But I'm definitely trying to create as much awareness as I can in my art pieces and the work that I do. So and everything that I do, even in hip hop, like when I travel and I teach dancing, I share a lot about my powwow background of me being a grass dancer. I created a whole new style of dancing. It's called the grass rocking. And it's a combination of like several street dances from the Bronx mixed with powwow dancing, with fancy dancing and grass dancing. And I would share that, like, that influence of like how I use my culture with the foundation that I was taught in hip hop, and how I show, that's how I share. So everything I do, it has that Indigenous seed that's always planted, and then kind of however it goes, it goes. I do things very like naturally. I try not to have high expectations of things. I like to go with the flow and just stay really like focused on whatever my message is or whatever the overall project goal is, to try to like complement what the group will be doing. And yeah, so it's important, you know, having Indigenous artists out there is really important. One thing that I really like about the fact that there are so many Indigenous-led artists is that it's Indigenous-led. It's not like some other culture saying, here, you know, we're gonna do this for you. And it's like them doing it, them telling our stories. And that's been happening for way too long in Canada. And that's why probably the narratives are the way that they are. And I love being part of that first wave or second wave or third wave that's going to change that and help influence there to be better dialogue that's more accurate to the truth, instead of there being romanticized narrative about what Native culture current situation is and or isn't, you know. So yeah, it's important for me, really important. It's also part of the Truth and Reconciliation Act. It's number 2 on there. So if you guys don't know about the Truth and Reconciliation Act, I think as a person that's living here on Turtle Island, it's your responsibility to know what you can do to help the Indigenous community overcome the genocide and the extreme oppression that we are currently facing to this day right now.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that, and thanks for elaborating too. Did I hear a cat? Oh, I just get so distracted so easily.
My cat, yeah, she's great, guys.
All right. I actually, oh no, there was something I wanted to amplify that what you said there. Yes, the presence of Indigenous people on campus. I thought that was a really important part of this project too. You bring Indigenous people here, right? So often it's well, there's a phrase right now. They want the art, not the people. And to make that kind of not the case, we want to make sure that that it's not, like Maria said, not a transactional relationship that becomes something that's transformative, right? That you can draw on and becomes a catalyst for presence, right?
And the artwork, I feel like, wouldn't exist without it being the extension of the body and the experiences. Yeah. And so, you know, even if it's not politically charged, like intentionally, it will be because it is in that space. And I think since King's College, I think, was one of the first colleges to exist in Canada to make space, to actually go through the actions of land back. What does that actually mean, you know, in our everyday? It's like there's a portion of this actual land kind of like being brought back, you know, in the sense that like the people who are gathering, the stories being told off that site, and the awareness of what is invisible being brought up. I think even for myself, a small part of this, to be informed by that and to really question it, and also like return with the stories. I might translate it and interpret it and relay it in a different way, but it does shape the way I think through my existence to the space.
Yeah. I think it was really important too that we had everyone, like, so not only that we have Indigenous artists on campus, but that kind of the experience of working together and like coordinating, especially our labor in this way. That became a really important way that we kind of reframe that relationship to each other. We're working together, right?
Yeah.
Really cool. I think we're coming around to the end of our time. I want to, if there's any questions, pop it in the chat, of course, but maybe in the final few minutes, I'd love, if there's any final thoughts or something we didn't get to, I'd love to hear from each of you. Some concluding thoughts, if you have some. Maybe I'll ask Kristi to go first, but again, if anyone has any questions, pop them in the chat.
I think I saw a hand just now, but it might have disappeared. I'm not sure. Oh yeah, it was Ali Erin Kaya.
Okay.
If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question, or if you feel more comfortable using the chat, feel free to do that too.
Yeah, I can unmute. So thanks a lot, everyone, for talks. It was really insightful. And so I'm an international student who just started learning about the culture of First Nations and Indigenous communities. So this question might come a little uninformed. So sorry for that in advance. So I do feel that all the work we've seen, the murals tree protection zone specifically has a strong relationship with a physical presence, both experiential and also network-wise. And I do find that similar to some traditional Turkey guards. And Ku has been like stressing the fact that his networks are physical in a sense that it might disappear in the case of a, let's say, COVID-19. So while we're trying to strengthen traditional arts in this era, we all probably like hear about NFTs, metaverse, and new media arts and all that. So my question is, how do you see the digitalization process of the art space transforming traditional arts and crafts as well as art networks? And do you have like any projections on the future of traditional crafts intersecting with digital?
I mean, they already do. We've always worked with whatever's available. I'm thinking in particular, like Isaac's and Kristi's resistance posters. They did those. They made those. Isaac said he had, when he had that dream of Thunderbird Woman, he woke up and he took his phone and he drew on the Doodle app with his finger. And that's how they became, he created this really quickly, really easily disseminated, easy made for dissemination kind of images. I actually think, Q, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your use of apps to make these murals, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like one of the things that like for being native is that I'm also taught to evolve with the changes to like the seasons. Things are going to keep changing, not going to stay the same. So it's important that I'm not, just kind of like just doing the same thing over and over. So I forgot the point of my question. I forgot what I was about to say.
I wanted to ask you about the Doodle
oh yes,
and how you
yes,
use digital media. Yeah.
I guess for me, like observation was always important. But when I started to work with professionals, I started to see that they have technology that they use and the equipment that they use. So I gravitated towards using like an iPad and using Procreate and kind of like just doing everything all in one, because I'm not like computer savvy at all. I'm like just hands-on. Like if you give me a paper and some pencils, I'm good. But digital stuff, I was always intimidated, but I use everything now digital. Like the TTC maps design I did was digital. The Daniels building was digital. The Daniels building feels surreal to me because I drew it on my lap. It was like this big, and like now it's like 90 meters long and 50 meters high. And so I try to evolve with the best possible equipment so that I can fit the standard. That's always what my goal is whatever that year's current standard is that's my bare minimum. I'm going to make sure I use the standards that everyone's looking for. Yeah, so I'm always using technology. In hip hop, they reinvented everything. In hip hop, the DJ didn't invent a turntable. They didn't invent a record. They didn't invent a needle. They didn't invent speakers. They didn't invent anything. They reinvented everything. They took what they had and created instruments out of something that wasn't supposed to be that type of instrument. Same with the dancing, same with the graffiti, same with the majority of the mentors that I had back in the day, they're like professional illustrators now. They're some of the most famous around the world too at it. Like one of my big mentors is this guy named Totem, and Totem is from Washington Heights. And he's like a legendary like designer who's been doing clothing brands, who's been doing just, so I've always tried to like use the influences that I have around me of how they adapt and how they kind of like stand out at the same time. And technology is like now it's the standard. You have to have some sort of digital presence. Otherwise people won't take you as serious, unfortunately. So it's a big influence and a big tool that I have to use. I'm pretty simple. I just use my iPad and Procreate and I'm good. Sometimes I use cameras too. I like cameras.
I was going to add that like the digital space, I think as an artist working with different histories and stories, it is more accessible, but it is the space of possibility, like Indigenous futurism, Afrofuturism. There's a lot of like future forward, like imagining and thinking. And I guess it allows someone to actually augment real spaces or methods and practices in a different way, where it might not be so possible like in real physical space. So as that, for a creative to work with that, I think it's quite exciting to have the chance to actually transform the space between physical and virtual. Like, I guess a good example is Lisa Jackson's VR of Toronto being taken back and like really trying to visualize what that space would look like in a different way. So, I know.
Can I mention something about the doodle grid? I totally forgot to say it. So to me, I learned some really cool techniques while painting really large murals. And one of the ways that I was taught how to save time and save paint would be to use projections. However, you can't always use a projection. It's actually super difficult to get everything right. And you have to have a power source, and most places don't. And it just creates a bunch of challenging obstacles. So one of my friends introduced me to this thing that's been quite popularized around the world, and that's the doodle grid. And essentially what it is you're taking a photo of the wall that you're going to be painting on, and then you take the digital graphics that you created on your, say your iPad, and you literally like lower the opacity of your artwork and layer it on top of the wall. And what you do is you prime the wall and you just randomly do doodles all over it. And so when you put your image over the grid, you're going to see like where every line and every proportion is supposed to be. So you just follow the proportions. It's a mental thing. It's not like you don't get to actually see the lines, like you have to create them, but the accuracy of it is amazing. It's almost like you can't do a mistake. The first portrait I ever did was a portrait of my mom. I did it last year. I did my mom and my dad next to each other at the Lansdowne underpass. And it was the first time I had ever done a portrait. And I used the doodle grid, and it came out really well. So if you haven't had a chance to ever hear about it, check it out, research it. It's super easy and accurate, and it makes everyone look like they're amazing artists.
That's awesome.
Learning that actually in our first few sessions, you were showing us how to use it, and I was like, whoa, this is so cool. Like, definitely speeds up the process for sure. Yeah. And yeah, I just wanted to mention a few things about the question, like in the TPZ project. When I was working on Isaac and Kristi's mural, yeah, we did actually some digital processes with that, with laser cutting, and using the, yeah, I think I did the laser cutting, and like I sent it to the laser cutter to get it done, and it definitely sped up the process a lot. I think using digital technologies is very convenient, and in terms of getting things done in such a short timeline, I think our timeline was very short. So I was like, okay, let's laser cut this, let's get it up there, and like you can't really make much of a mistake when you have a template already cut out. So I think, yeah, we did use some digital processes to help speed things up a little bit. Sure.
Definitely. We still have those stencils.
Oh yeah,
are available for other applications.
Oh, they were very useful.
Wonderful.
I think for me, the most important thing about like my awareness of what I'm doing is one of my mentors, he's a photographer, and he told me, he said, make sure that you use the technology, don't let the technology use you. And always that approach.
Yeah, makes sense. Right. I think we only have a few minutes left. Do you guys need to need a couple moments to wrap things up, or
Yeah, we can wrap things up now. Thank you guys so much for that talk. It was so interesting and thought-provoking, and felt very relevant in like our current climate with a lot of current events. And it's so exciting to like learn more about the process, because from Rhea and Marina, we really just have seen like the pictures online and like heard little bits and pieces from you guys. So it's really exciting learning more about your own careers and the TPZ project as a whole. So I wanted to thank everyone also for coming and for your questions. And also to remind you guys that ArtWORK is going to be continuing tomorrow, not with this panel, but with a different group of speakers that will kind of focus more on different careers in art and give you guys some like networking opportunities with some art professionals in Toronto. So we're really looking forward to seeing you all there. And yeah, thank you everyone so much again. It's been such a great couple of hours, and yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed.
And thank you so much, Nick and Kristi and Q and Maria, for accepting our invitations and being part of this. And yeah, thank you.
All right,
Thank you guys so much.
Miigwech.